All right, everybody, welcome back to the second part of our Lab 2 AV lecture series. So this is AV lecture 2B. In this unit, we're actually going to get into our next body system for our 201 laboratory series. That's going to be the skeletal system. So this will be the introductory unit to that. The functions of the skeletal system, they're pretty wide and broad, and some of them are going to be very intuitive, while others are going to be, somewhat interesting and potentially unique. Examples of functions of the skeletal system include not only support, but protection. Think of the skull, if you will, protecting the brain, or the breastbone and ribs protecting the heart and lungs. Obviously, aiding in movement. And then we have a process called hematopoiesis. Really, this is the formation of blood, so red and white blood cells. Erythropoiesis and leukopoiesis are let me start that over. Hematopoiesis is the collective term for formation of blood. Erythropoiesis is specifically referring to red blood cells themselves, whereas leukopoiesis is referring to the white blood cells. One of the other interesting aspects of the skeletal system is it acts as a mineral reserve, meaning it stores minerals, such as calcium. One of the electrolytes that you'll find that has to stay in homeostatic balance within the human body is calcium. Calcium we see not only in action potential production, but we also see it in skeletal muscle contraction. We see it associated with a wide range of the body's systems. So it's an important electrolyte that needs to stay in balance, and the skeletal system assists the body in doing that. The skeletal system also plays an active role in maintaining the pH balance of the body, acid-base balance. We don't get into a whole lot of the physiology with respect to the mineral reserve portion, but you'll cover that in great detail with Dr. Prodi or Dr. Keller in lecture. The skeletal system can be broken down into two divisions, the axial skeleton and then the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is really comprised of the skull, the hyoid bone, which is a bone that sits beneath really the jawbone here. We'll give you the name for that, the official name for that later on in the course. But then we have the vertebral column, the ribs, and the sternum. We then have something called the appendicular skeleton. And essentially what this is referring to is the body's appendages. So for instance, you have the extremities here, the upper extremities, the bones that are associated with it. So we have the clavicle, the scapula, you have the humerus, ulnar radius, and the bones of the wrist and hand. And then you have the femur, tibia, fibula, and then the bones of the ankle and foot. In addition to that, you have what we call the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is also called the os coxae. Collectively, those make up the appendicular skeleton. This is an image from your text, and this is going to be the first image where you're going to have to start mastering and memorizing and be able to not only identify by bone, but also by picture. So both picture and bone, the various names of all of these parts, the various names of all these bones in the human body. Hopefully some of you went out and took my suggestion and purchased those anatomical flashcards. This is going to be one of the first units where they're going to become pretty dang useful, so I hope that that you guys start carrying those flashcards with you. Maybe on your way to class you're flipping through them, maybe waiting in line at Starbucks, so forth. If you got that extra 2 or 3 minutes, it really does pay dividends to just start practicing these at any moment that you have time. So make sure you know all these bones, not only the picture form, but are able to identify the individual bones, and you'll get practice with that in lab. As I just said, no table 8.1 in your laboratory manual. There is another table, table 8.2, This table, if you guys have time and you can begin to look at it now, it will become very, very helpful to you later on in the course. So although it's not a, yes, you memorize this 100% today, if you can just review it and become familiar with it, it'll help you significantly later on. All right, as I said, I try and throw some interesting stuff at you, and here's just one of those interesting little random tidbits that I like to give out. Maybe some of you have younger siblings or cousins or older brothers and sisters that may have just had a child, so forth. But infants, newborns, when they are born, actually have around 300 bones. Now compare that to adults. Human adults, have around 200 to 206 bones. So this really is kind of unique. How did we go from 300 bones in an infant to really 200 as an adult? Well, the answer is bones fuse. And we're going to learn about how that actually occurs in a moment when we begin to talk about long bones, and you'll learn about it in great depth in lecture when you look at growth plate of bones. So as bones age, a lot of bones fuse, forming one solid bone, which then reduces the number. All right, let's talk about now sort of the bone composition. Essentially, what is bone made up of? Bone has really two main components, an organic component and an inorganic component. The organic component of bone is really the cells and then these protein fibers, and specifically the protein is collagen. Okay, so we'll discuss the different types of cells that we see within bone here in a moment, but that's just one aspect of it. The next is the inorganic component. The inorganic component is really this complex calcium salt called hydroxyapatite. This complex calcium salt is really made up of calcium phosphatate and calcium carbonate. Collectively, that makes up the inorganic component. When the organic and inorganic components adhere or come together in proper ratio, this creates a very solid living tissue, which all of us know as bone. All right, looking at the cells of the inorganic component, or I'm sorry, of the organic component, we're going to be looking at now the bone cells. First, we'll start off with looking at a root word. Osteo is referring to bone, so you'll notice that all of these bone cells start with the word osteo, meaning, hey, it's dealing with the skeletal system. The first line of cells that we're going to look at are the osteogenic cells. These are the bone stem cells. These bone stem cells give rise to the bone building cells, meaning the cells that make bone increase in strength, increase in size. And those are called the osteoblasts and osteocytes. We see these osteogenic cells in the outer covering of bone called the periosteum, the inner covering of bone called the endosteum, and then central canals found within bone. And although I don't have a picture of it here, you'll see, and I'll point out the periosteum, endosteum, and central canal in a moment. Osteoblasts are the first cells that come from these osteogenic stem cells. Osteoblast, anytime you see the word blast in any of the body systems, it generally refers to an immature cell. And in this case, it is an immature bone cell. Well, how does it actually mature? It then mature. How does it occur? How does it mature? Well, it matures by actually getting encased or getting trapped in a matrix. Okay? So this is the flow, if you will. You have the osteogenic stem cells that give rise to these osteoblasts. These osteoblasts mature into osteocytes. How did they mature? Well, they get trapped in a deposited matrix. Okay? Those osteocytes in that deposited matrix allow really bone to remodel or respond to a stress. Let's say you've started an exercise regimen, a weight-bearing exercise regimen. Now what the bones need to do is actually increase in size. So you put more osteoblasts out. Those osteoblasts get trapped in matrix, turn to osteocytes, increasing the strength of bone. We see osteocytes located in lacunae, and I'll point those out in a moment where the lacunae are. The last type of bone cell that we're going to look at, interestingly, does not come from our bone stem cell. It actually comes from what we call a hemocytoblast. This is a blood stem cell. So here we have a bone cell, but coming from the blood line. It's kind of interesting. Its job, this osteoclast job, is really, it lies on the surface of bones and it begins to break down bone. So let's say you need calcium released into the bloodstream because you have low blood calcium levels. Well, one of the things that we can do is activate osteoclasts. It starts breaking down bone, it releases calcium into the bloodstream, and then blood calcium levels increase. So how do they break down bone? Using a very strong acid called hydrochloric acid. So HCl here is the acid that breaks down the bone, releasing that calcium. We can actually classify bone using 4 main categories. The categories include long, short, flat, and irregular. These categories are based on the shape itself. Long bones, as the name implies, are more long than they are wide or broad. So for instance, the femur is an example of a long bone. Short bones are equal in not only length but width, relatively equal in length and width. Classic example of that are the wrist bones and certain bones of the ankle and foot. Flat bones are bones that are flat, such as the breastbone, also called the sternum. And then we have certain bones in the skull, even bones in the os coxae, scapula, so forth, that are all considered flat. Well, what happens if we don't have a bone that doesn't fit into one of those 3 categories? This is sort of our miscellaneous bag, if you will. It's called the irregular category. Bones that don't fit into any one of the 3 above fit into the irregular category. Classic example of that is the vertebrae bone, right? Or is a vertebrae bone. So if you look here, it's just, a cartoon image showing the different categories. Long bones, as I've said, include ulna, radius, femur. Those are the long ones. Here we have the short bones. Then we have flat bones, sternum, scapula. Then we have irregular bones, once again showing the vertebrae, and then a bone called the sphenoid bone, which is found in the skull that you'll learn about. All right, bone morphology. We're going to look at the morphological characteristics of long bones first, and then we'll take a look at flat bones. Long bones, if you recall, are longer than they are wide. Well, at the ends of long bones are something called the epiphyseal regions. These epiphyseal regions, so here would be one, here would be one. At the ends of these epiphyseal regions are articular cartilage. That articular cartilage articulates, meaning it connects to another bone. That articular cartilage reduces friction when those bones are rubbing together. So we see this a lot of the time in joints. Think of the knee, think of the elbow, so forth. We then have the diaphyseal region, or diaphysius. This is really the region down the center of a long bone, or the shaft, if you will. The diaphysius region has very, very thick walls of compact bone that allow it to really have strength. So it's going to be very, very strong in that region, and that's there to prevent or assist in preventing bone breakage. Now, just a little interesting fact again. When we are talking about bones growing, a child has 300 bones, how they go from 300 to 200. Well, I said fusing occurs. An interesting fact, uh, children in long bones have really what we call a hyaline cartilage model. That hyaline cartilage model allows for really the shape of a long bone to form, and then subsequently the hyaline will, for lack of better terms, become bone cells. Granted, it's much more complex than that. In a lecture, you guys will learn all about that, but for sake of just simplicity, that's what we'll use here. What they're showing you here is something called a growth plate. A growth plate is also called the epiphyseal plate. And in children, this is where actually growth of the long bone is occurring. Once the bone has grown to its mature length, we no longer have an epiphyseal plate. We now have an epiphyseal line. So notice here, this is just a cartoon showing that, hey, here's it in embryo, a young person having the growth plates, and then an adult having those growth lines, or the epiphyseal lines. Clinically, for those of you that may want to go into peds, if a child or a young individual that has these growth plates has a bone break, and that bone break has altered that epiphyseal plate, this could actually inhibit or stunt long bone growth. And so that's one of the common things that they look at is if, I don't know, you're a kid, you're climbing a tree, you fall out and break your arm, whatever the case may be, they're immediately not only going to want to treat that, but they're also going to want to look at those epiphyseal plates to make sure those haven't been harmed. All right, continuing on with the bone morphology of long bones, we're actually going to see two different structural type of bones associated with them. The first is going to be compact. The compact bone is really the exterior portion of long bones. We see compact bone thicker in that diaphyseal shaft region than we do at the articular surfaces, but nevertheless, compact bone surrounds the exterior surface of long bones the whole way. Spongy bone is found on the interior portions of the bone. They will look very, very different, but the composition, the bone composition, meaning the organic and inorganic material that makes up the bone, is exactly the same. We do see, though, in spongy bone, these little plate-like protrusions called trabeculae. These little trabeculae are there and running in different directions to reduce stress and dissipate force, if you will, that's being put on the bone. So it's there as a protective mechanism. What we also see associated with long bones is something called the medullary cavity. This is really the cavity that's contained in the middle of the long bones. And it contains bone marrow, which is the site of that hematopoiesis. So here's a good example of everything that I was just describing. You'll look at the compact bone in this region that they've trimmed away elsewhere. But here's the compact bone, then you're looking at the spongy bone. There's that medullary cavity that contains the marrow for the hematopoiesis. Now we also have some connective tissue coverings that are associated with long bones. The first is going to be something called periosteum. Periosteum is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it covers the outside portion of long bones. It also contains something called osteoblasts. These are bone-building cells and osteoclasts. So these bone-building cells are actually found just beneath it. I'm sorry, the osteoblasts are there, and the osteoclasts, those bone breakdown cells, are found just beneath it to break down bone. What really is the function of the periosteum? Well, it allows connection of tendons and ligaments from other body tissues, meaning it anchors it in place. Now, something interesting with the periosteum. For those of you that are avid runners, or maybe you've played a lot of basketball or tennis, whatever the case may be, if you've ever had shin splints, and if you haven't, they're pretty painful, but shin splints, what it is really the periosteum is actually being separated from the bone. So the working tissues actually pull the periosteum away and create a micro-inflammatory event, creating that pain, aka shin splints. The next connective tissue that you're going to look at is something called the endosteum. The endosteum lies in the middle of that medullary cavity. It's the middle covering of the bone, if you will, but it is connected to the periosteum. It's also made of dense, irregular connective tissue. The osteoblasts are found just below it. So, these two, both made of dense, irregular connective tissue, connected. One happens to be on the outer surface, one happens to be on the inner. And then at the ends, the epiphyseal regions, you have that articular cartilage, which is there to articulate with other bones and reduce bone friction during joint movement. All right, flat bones actually have a unique morphological composition, and they're sort of like a sandwich, if you will. We see here, and the skull is a great example of this. The skull in this little section here has one layer of compact bone, and in the middle you have spongy bone. Just beneath that you have compact bone. So I want you guys to think of your two slices of bread, if you will, your compact bone, and all the goodies in your sandwich are going to be your spongy bone. Now this morphological setup here is very important for structural stability, but also to dissipate force. The compact bone there is to really protect the body from initial impact, but the spongy bone disperses that force, so then you don't get fracturing and then subsequent damage of tissue beneath the bone. In this case, it would be the brain. So that's very, very important. All right, when we look at histological slides of bone, in this lab, we're going to be looking at two different types, one called ground bone and another called decalcified bone. Bone, as I've stated earlier, is a living tissue. It just happens to be a very tough, hard living tissue. So it's difficult for us to do much more than look at ground bone and decalcified bone. This ground bone and then the decalcified bone are going to be the two slides that I need you guys to practice with on your own at home using the DVD, and then again in lab that we'll look at it. We'll look at ground bone first. Ground bone has a couple anatomical features that I'm going to need you to know. The first is going to be an osteon. And here, what they have protruding up in this cartoon image, this is an osteon that's been cut in half. If you look at that, that's a full osteon. The osteon is really the smallest functional unit of bone, and it's made up of layers called lamellae. Okay? So each of these little layers of the lamellae. Inside the center of that osteon is something called the central canal. Central canals run vertically and actually house blood vessels and nerves. Now these are important because there's something called lacunae. Lacunae are the regions that are portions that are found that central canal. Those lacunae house the encased or trapped osteocytes. And remember, an osteocyte is an immobile living cell. Therefore, it has metabolic activity. These central canals are allowing the lacunae to really essentially get nutrients. Okay? Even further breaking down this, there's something canaliculi. These are very, very thin tubes that connect to the central canal itself, and these really provide nutrients and waste removal to the metabolically active osteocytes, meaning the living osteocytes. So here's a really good histological image of it. This whole thing, an osteon, which you notice here in the middle is that central canal. What you're looking at is those little tube-like projections, the canaliculi. The lacunae housing the actual osteocytes. The lamellae, those are those layers that we were talking about that assist in making up the osteon. Now, the next image that we're going to look at here, the next histological image, is the decalcified bone. Decalcified bone, the name implies it's been decalcified. And what we're looking at here, I'll go from the inside of the medullary cavity out. So we're going to go from deep to superficial. Here on the inside, you're looking at the bone marrow. Along that medullary cavity is that endosteum. Then we have our compact bone that's containing the osteocytes. More superficially to that is the periosteum, the dense irregular connective tissue that's continuous with the endosteum. Superficial to the periosteum is the skeletal muscle, and although they don't show it, if it were here, we'd have the hypodermis, dermis, epidermis, and then outside environment. So that's the decalcified histological bone that you'll need to practice with. Now, what do you guys have to know from this lecture? Essentially everything on this slide. So long bones, you're going to need to be able to identify the various regions, growth plate, growth line, know where the endosteum, periosteum, and medullary cavity are. Then you're going to need to be able to identify bones and put them into their correct categories. You're going to need to be able to look at the ground bone slide and identify these various anatomical structures. You're going to need to be able to look at a decalcified bone slide and identify those structures. Now that's really it for the introductory unit of the skeletal system. I urge you guys to really start to practice with this now, because it is, really useful just to have lots of repetition with it. It'll, assist you and hopefully help you a lot in mastering the material. We have one more AV lecture for this unit, and that's the appendicular skeleton. So take a little break, and if you have time, come back and listen to that next lecture.